Okay, in part two of this lecture on class and inequality, I'm going to move on from the description of inequalities I was talking about in the previous part of the lecture to outline two of the fundamental class theorists, who are often referred to two of the founding fathers of sociology, in terms of Marx and Weber. So they're kind of, I suppose, more associated with the critical tradition of social theory. In week two, we looked at, the functionalist, the critical, and the interactionist perspective. Certainly Marx is, I suppose, one of the founders of the critical schools of social theory. Weber's also quite critical as well, but also starts to bring in notions of everyday interaction and is often seen as being really influential on the kind of traditions of symbolic interactionism as well. In the third recording, I'll talk about Bourdieu, who brings all these things together, I suppose, in one way or another. So, in some ways, the functional kind of way of seeing the world, would argue that some inequalities are okay, it's similar to that liberal capitalist thing where it can motivate people to succeed, but really they wouldn't be too happy with too much inequality because they see that as being detrimental to the functioning of society as well. So there's a kind of balance there between too much inequality and some being good from that model. In the critical school, though, inequality is seen as basically a kind of threat to the lives of humans and the very possibility of being happy or satisfied, and in Marx's term, being able to, I suppose, participate in what he calls the species being, which is kind of the true needs of human societies in the ways that, as humans and individuals, the way that he defined it. So to start off with, before I talk about Marx, I'd like you just to pause this recording and have a look at the short 10-minute cartoon video that is on the first couple of slides, the link there that outlines Marx, and then I'll start again after you see that. So, Marx is, one of the most famous philosophers of all time, one of the founding fathers of political economy, with others, like Adam Smith and the likes, Ricardo. But I think before I start talking about Marx, it's important to kind of separate Marx's philosophy and Marx's theories with Marxism as a kind of political movement and with the establishment of, communist societies throughout the 20th century. Really, there's never been a communist society develop in the organic way that Marx hoped it would happen, I suppose. It tended to happen from a band of, educated elites or some forms of elites that kind of brought it into a system, and it never really happened, for the most part throughout the world from, working class revolutions. So, many would point to the kind of failure of communist societies as a failure of Marxist thought, but really it's more of a failure of the differences between theory and practice, I think. So Marxist theories, I think, are still really, really useful for thinking about how the world works, how capitalism is exploitative and alienating, and how class systems function. But, as many of the things that he got right, that he also maybe could argue he got many things wrong as well, and we'll look at those a little bit in the next few sections. Marx is essentially a theorist of capitalism. He was writing at the start of the Industrial Revolution, where there was huge social changes in the world, and he was interested in what he called the mode of production. He was writing at the time when, what was called feudalism was shifting to what he called capitalism. So within that capitalist system, there's a fundamental struggle. Marx was interested in the struggle between the workers and the capitalists, between what he called the ruling class and the working class, or the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. I've already discussed a little bit how capitalism needs constant growth, and so what we see here is really, in terms of globalization, has been the constant need for more markets, more resources, more producers. And in many ways this kind of has played out how Marx predicted. Cheaper wages means increased competition, so companies can move around the world and eke out more and more profit. Unemployment and underemployment and things like that are also, relatively not that bad things under capitalism, because it keeps the workers in their place, keeps wages down, makes people work harder, makes people feel precarious, and therefore, invest more in that system. So in this sense, class isn't just a kind of thing about socio-economic status, about who has what in Marx's system. It's a system of struggle that kind of drives the system forward. So Marx's conception of class here isn't just about who owns what or who doesn't own what. It's about how this is very much fundamental to how capitalism functions as a social system. So Marx developed what was called the base superstructure model. The base is largely made up of the means and the relations of production. The means of production are basically who owns the things that are most important for production to happen. This being, when Marx was writing the factories and the tools and the land and the raw materials and these kind of things. You could argue today that maybe the owners of the means of production are also now the people that own things like Facebook and Uber and that kind of stuff as well. So within the base there's the means of production, the ownership of those things, and the relations of production, the way that different groups in society relate to each other, how they have access to or own various parts of that means of production, and the role that they play within that. So as you've seen that the base, that kind of the economic model that society has works in, kind of dominates everything else. So there's the base and the superstructure. The superstructure is made up of everything that isn't to do specifically with production, not about making stuff or making information today. This is art and law and politics and all this kind of stuff. And the superstructure is the thing that creates what Marx called ideology, the capitalist way of thinking about the world, of being in the world, and not thinking too much about that exploitation and alienating relationships that capitalism produces. So while the base dominates the superstructure also shapes back into the base, and there's a kind of, an element of social change that happens, but really, the relations between the owners and the workers doesn't change too much. The base is generally dominant in that sense. So in terms of Marx's theory of capital, there's the means of production, which is owned by the ruling class, the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, but they're only a kind of minority of society, a very small percentage of society. There's a much larger group, which Marx called the working class or the proletariat. And basically, for those people to survive, for the working class to survive, all they have to sell is their own labour. If they don't sell their own labour, they will starve. They'll have nowhere to live. They'll have nothing to eat. So the ruling class owns all the stuff that the working class needs to have access to do this labour, and therefore the relationship becomes fundamentally exploitative. Two classes are therefore, opposed in their interests. One wants to maintain that kind of exploitative relationship, while one wants to kind of gain more and more freedoms and more, autonomy. So Marx views that relationship as what he called as fundamentally exploitative, what we call exploitation. For Marx, the workers are exploited by the ruling class. Exploitation here refers to the idea that even though workers produce more than they need themselves, this is called the surplus, they don't get to keep this. This is kind of siphoned off by the ruling class as profit. So this is the fundamentally exploitative relationship between the workers and the rulers. And that, for Marx, is the fundamental class relation in capitalism. This is a two-class system, the bourgeoisie and a proletariat. He predicted that the rich would go richer. He predicted also that the workers would be increasingly forced to work for subsistence. In essence, this means that the proletariat are wage slaves. They have no choice to opt out of this system at all. Now you can see that the class system may be a little bit too simplistic. Marx also talked about the petty bourgeoisie and some other groups of people as well, but fundamentally this is the kind of key relationship in capitalism from a Marxist point of view. So in terms of the capitalist mode of production, as I said, the capitalists own the means of production, and this is what produces things. It's all the stuff that we need to live by, including the distribution of food, the building of houses, the production of goods. This is how, in a Marxist system, it's argued that the exploitation is about the production of surplus value. Value is produced by labour. It's produced by the blood, sweat, and tears of the working class, and isn't just produced by exchange, as theorised in classical economics. So the worker produces all this stuff. The worker gets paid a kind of subsistence wage, and then the owner takes the rest for profit. Importantly, there's not just exploitation going on here, but Marx also talks about how the worker is alienated from their own product. So alienation describes a kind of feeling of estrangement, where the products of one's labour is kind of under less and less control of the worker, and this is largely based on the way that capitalism starts to become a factory system, where products aren't made by one person anymore, so a chair isn't crafted by one person, and put together from, a block of wood and shaped and done all by one person. It's done on a factory line where one person sits on one leg, one person sits on another. This is again like, the Industrial Revolution. And so what this means is that the worker becomes a kind of cog in that machine. They lose the ability to express themselves in their work, to be creative, and they just become part of that kind of machine system. This is for Marx fundamentally alienating, because for Marx, our true species being is being creative and being able to express ourselves through not just kind of work, but through art and all this kind of other things as well. The capitalist system kind of crushes the ability to be able to do that, makes it more rationalised, makes it more boring, and makes it more kind of factory-like. The photo there is, at factories in China that make iPhones. The conditions there are so dire that there was a huge problem with the workers committing suicide. Rather than actually fix the actual problems in the workplace, they just put up nets to try and stop the people jumping off the building, or at least catch them so they wouldn't die. I think that's a kind of, a very good illustration of the relations of production in a capitalist system. So, in terms of what's happened and what was predicted, so by Marx, reducing union powers, it's definitely happened. Governments fundamentally have tried to destroy unions, which allows, workers to band together and try and, fight for their own rights. There's constant pressures to keep wages low, to the point where, throughout the 80s and 90s, we had this new category of the working poor. For the first time, people with, for about a century really, people with full-time jobs were actually earning money that was still below the poverty line. The working day has been extended more and more, more and more exploitation going on here. And certainly things like technology have sped up the pace of work. But there's an interesting kind of juxtaposition there where full-time work is actually more rare. The people doing full-time work are working more hours than ever before. But, actually having one full-time job is increasingly difficult to get, and more people have multiple jobs or underemployed, casualised, short-term contracts, 0-hour contracts. So they're kind of in this precarious situation, which also, is fundamentally exploitative and alienating. I mentioned already that the de-skilling thing, processes of Fordism in particular just kind of made individual workers part of the machine rather than having their own creativity. And increasingly today, workers are being replaced by machines and algorithms themselves, and this creates more efficiency, more surplus value, but also contributes to problems of and underemployment. So one of the things that Marx predicted was, would be living on subsistence wages. That's not necessarily the case, although, as I was talking about, there is more working poor and more casualisation, and there's more and more people in places like Australia and the Western world in general that are living week to week. That there's a increasing kind of saying that, some people are like 2 weeks or a month away from being homeless because of that kind of subsistence. But at the same time, there's been the growth of what we call consumerism, and the way that they are, all the efficiencies that I was just talking about in terms of production have created access to cheaper and cheaper consumer products. So people influenced by Marx have started to argue throughout the 20th century that consumerism became a key tool of ideology, that we were given all these kind of shiny things to keep us in our place, to keep us occupied, keep us preoccupied, keep us kind of distracted from our alienation and our exploitation. And I'll talk about aspects of that in some detail in the week on consumption. One of the things that Marx theorised and predicted that would happen is that a class consciousness would arise in the workers. That as exploitation and alienation became increasingly dire, increasingly extreme, that the workers would start to recognise their own exploitation and band together and overthrow capitalism. This when revolutions would occur and capitalism would then become move towards communism. Now again, this hasn't necessarily happened, and much of the social theory in recent times that we'll look at throughout the course, particularly likes of Beck and Giddens and Bauman's and many others, talk about how class consciousness is increasingly disappearing, and that our identities tend to be more around everyday groups and where we live and related to gender and race and all kinds of other things rather than class. So again, we'll look at some ideas about the how and why of that throughout the next couple of weeks as well. So despite the fact that Marx is kind of associated with, the failure of communist regimes and all that kind of stuff, and his work is overtly critical of capitalism, his work was kind of, in a way, fundamentally idealistic. He argued that exploitation and alienation would be defeated and we would move toward a communist utopia where everyone's interests would be placated, I suppose. So there's a kind of play-off there between the theory and practice, as I was talking about before, about whether, human needs would be met in a communist society or not. That's a whole other course, I suppose. But I think Marx is particularly still really important to think about in critically engaging with capitalism itself. And obviously Marx's work has been fundamentally influential on the very development of sociology. The second theorist I want to talk about is Max Weber, again one of the men seen as the founding fathers of sociology. And Weber was influenced by Marx, was kind of writing, against Marx in a way of kind of taking on a lot of what Marx said, but kind of then critically engaging and developing that work. Essentially, Weber saw much of what Marx had to say as a little bit oversimplistic and built on that analysis to build a more kind of multi-dimensional view of social conflict. Particularly came up with a more kind of complexified class strata, I suppose. For Weber, he agreed that social stratification and class was about material relations, about what you own and what you don't. But Weber started to think about how this was also inflected throughout cultures, and social status also was about. So relations to social status and party become important here, and I'll define those in a minute. For Weber, this kind of status became an important way to think about class, not just about the economic aspects of it, but the cultural and symbolic aspects as well. So while these things reflect one's economic resources, and this kind of influences what can be sold and exchanged on a market, it also has other knock-on effects related to kind of the way that people relate to each other in the world. Weber was interested in what he called the market, and this is this kind of area of negotiation where people come together as buyers and sellers and buy and sell the particular resources they have. And that doesn't necessarily mean things. It also means the way that we relate to each other, the way we think about other people. Weber coined the term life chances, again a term that's used quite commonly throughout society today. And so class here is, again, he's interested in how there's a more complex picture in terms of exploitation and alienation, in terms of what life chances mean to different people in different parts of society. So class situations are not just about a person's relationship to the means of production, but also about the resources they have and how they use those resources to bargain in the market, Resources here can be particularly about education credentials, inheritance, people's memberships of unions and professional accreditations, and importantly, your gender, race, ethnicity, and age. So status here isn't just about class as well, it relates to all those things. So our life chances are, I suppose, correlated to, how much property you have, what your education is, what gender, race, ethnicity we are, and things like that. So you can see here that Weber's building a more complex picture of those opportunity structures, I suppose. He was definitely interested in how there's more than two classes. He defined more than two classes in terms of life chances. And social class becomes a kind of combination of those objective material things and more subjective marketable skills, education qualifications and stuff like that. So you can see here where Marx had a kind of two-class system. Weber extends this to kind of point out that, sure, there's a ruling class, but there's more complex things going on underneath that. There's the intelligentsia, pretty much professional white-collar workers, those that tend to, work with their mind more with their bodies. The petty bourgeoisie, those that kind of, own small businesses, shopkeepers and things like that. And there's the working class, and they tend to be the ones that do the blue-collar work, that, use their bodies as labour. And Weber did some kind of complex analysis of the different life chances of those groups. So in this sense, while Marx said class was objective, Weber brings in things beyond the economic to the kind of more cultural and symbolic aspects that relate to notions of status, more subjective elements. So status here refers to differences between social groups, and differences in honour and prestige they are accorded by others. Status here is the relations of people within a class system and how they kind of themselves have hierarchies in terms of how they think about those people. So these status groups are not just economically determined. They tend to revolve around shared lifestyles and shared things like tastes and morals and those kind of things. And they make the class picture a little bit more complex in the sense that even those who are kind of really wealthy, there tends to be status systems that are going on within them between, say, the new rich and old money. The way that we think about poor people often has status things within it as well. The respectable working class versus, what are deemed yobbos or white trash or whatever. I've been looking at this kind of stuff through my work on hipsters and bogans as well. What's interesting about the status thing too is that, as some recent social theorists, including the likes of Ulrich Becker, pointed out, that the highly educated now increasingly go through periods of living in inequality and living in poverty. So often, students even from relatively privileged backgrounds live in relative poverty while they're studying and while they're living away from home in university. And there's also kind of complex pictures when it comes to taste as well that I'll go into more detail when I talk about Bourdieu, but not all rich people go to the opera. They can be into things like footy and stuff as well. So status here isn't necessarily completely determined by material and economic situations. Weber also theorised the concept what he called party. So there's status systems, but then there's also party, the voting blocks and social movements that people get involved in. Again, that often correlate to their class position, but often, don't as well, or are more complex than just correlating to class position. So party here refers to groups of individuals who work together because they have common interests, backgrounds, aims, and things like that. And this can influence social status stratification independent of class and status. So what this means is that power can arise from ideas, not just economic situations. And people with shared interests can often bandy together to kind of change society. And they do this through things like social movements. And we've seen this historically through the rise of, the Greens and environmental politics, family first kind of conservative movements in recent times. and certainly women's movements and feminism throughout the 20th century and today. These are social movements that are organised not around the economic, but around other political, social, and everyday, I suppose, forms of politics. So you can see here Weber's particularly interested in thinking about the kind of complex ways that we bandy together, or the ways that we kind of separate ourselves from others, and we do this through notions of status and party. So in terms of the class system, Weber saw a more complex picture, and he was particularly interested in what he thought that would be the rise of the middle-class bureaucrat. And we can see this is largely played out, that, there's more and more bureaucracies in societies, they're increasingly rationalised. Anyone that's ever been to Centrelink or, even in a university system can see just how much bureaucracy there is, what we call red tape, how we're treated as a number and all that kind of thing. Weber argued that things like bureaucracies were going to be necessary because societies were going to become more and more complex, and you'll need something like a bureaucracy to make them run efficiently, in inverted commas, there. But what this would mean for societies is that they would become increasingly rationalised. And by rationalised there, he talks about how it's horrible to think that the world would one day be filled with little cogs, little men clinging to little jobs and striving towards bigger ones. Weber argued essentially that we would grow societies to what he called the iron cage of rationality, and that we would be trapped in that. This would mean that we would go through processes of dehumanisation, where in more and more situations in our day-to-day lives, we would treat each other not as humans, but as numbers, or as, in these transactional relationships that, again, like Marx talks about with species being, aren't really the kind of true way that humans want to relate to each other. So Weber wasn't particularly optimistic about the future. He argued that there would be a spread of this iron cage throughout societies at all. We would be increasingly dehumanised through these rational principles, and there'd be little chance for escape for this. He called this, essentially, we'd be trapped in this iron cage of rationality. He argued that people will be a small cog in a ceaselessly moving mechanism which prescribes to him an essentially fixed route of march. And you can see here there's the kind of usual, sexist language in that kind of late 19th and early 20th century writing there. So again, Weber's not particularly idealistic. I suppose he's much more pessimistic than Marx in terms of what was going to happen in the future. And again, this is another quote from Weber: "No one knows who will live in this cage in the future, or whether at the end of this tremendous development entirely new profits will arise, or there will be a great rebirth of old ideas and ideals, or, if neither, mechanised petrification embellished with a sort of convulsive self-importance. For of the last stage of this cultural development, it might as well be truly said, specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart, the nullity imagines that this nullity imagines that it has attained a civilization never before achieved." What Weber is kind of arguing there is that as societies become more and more rationalised, we'll just be normalised, and we won't actually understand that kind of civilization that we're building will have gone through this dehumanised and economically rationalised process. Okay, so to conclude this part of the lecture, comparing Marx and Weber's class theories, Marx was kind of, his object of study was the structures of society, the way that capitalism itself was based on that exploitative relationship, and how capitalism, through that base superstructure model, would produce ideologies that would keep people in their place. But he argued that basically exploitation and alienation would go to such an extent that people would develop a class consciousness and, form revolutions and move towards communism. Marx didn't kind of look at the big picture as much as that. He tended to look at smaller case studies, looking at the middle-class bureaucrat and, the rise of party and stuff like that. For Marx, class is objective. It's about those material measures. For Weber, class has aspects of those objective measures, but is also subjective. It relates to those notions of status and things like that. So Marx is looking at those kind of large-scale kind of, types of society, that moved from feudalism to capitalism. Weber was concerned at looking at things like life chances and market situations. Patterns of consumption as well as production, I suppose. So where Marx is kind of economically determinist, Weber brings in status to understand cultural elements of class relations. So Marx sees that people fit the structure, but really Weber says it's kind of more complex than that, and within that structure people are kind of struggling over their own needs and necessities and wants and desires. Where Marx was quite utopian, even though he predicted the rise of violent revolutions or whatever that would eventually move to a communist utopia, at least what he saw as utopia. Weber sketched out this kind of rather negative future of the iron cage of rationality. Okay, that's well in the second part of the lecture, and I'll talk about the work of Pierre Bourdieu in the third part.